In the year 1573 BCE, Chamos, a young prince of Thebes, set his sights on revenge and glory in the cause of freedom for his Egypt, a land that had been held in thrall for about 100 years. Assembling about him the noblemen of southern Egypt, he told them of his plans for dealing with the Hyksos, the Asian oppressors who occupied the Nile Delta to the north. "I intend to fall on him and slit his belly. It is my desire to save Egypt and smite the Asiatic." The nobles murmured their protests. They were enjoying abundant crops and robust prosperity. The Hyksos even allowed them to graze their cattle around the papyrus marshes of the Delta region. But the Theban prince was resolute. "I am determined to battle the Asiatics," he said, "and the entire land will speak of me in Thebes as Chamos, the protector of Egypt." Chamos prevailed, and the armed forces of Upper Egypt sailed down the Nile against the enemy. The Hyksos were a motley collection of Semitic tribes that emerged out of the desert around 1700 BCE, and in the words of a later Egyptian priest, had savagely burned the cities, razed the temples of the gods to the ground, and treated the whole native population with the utmost cruelty. Perhaps the Hyksos had indeed dealt savagely with the Egyptians, yet these barbarians were also beguiled by the civilization they had conquered. After overrunning Memphis, the Egyptian capital near the head of the delta, the Hyksos established their own center of power at Avaris, in the delta's eastern frontier. From there, they exercised direct rule over the northern part of Egypt, while exacting tribute from the outlying rulers, including the restless princes of Thebes with their sun-bathed city some 600 miles south of the Nile's mouth. At the same time, the Hyksos took on Egyptian ways. They employed Egyptian administrators and tax collectors. They wrote in hieroglyphics. They worshipped Egyptian gods along with their own, and the rulers called themselves pharaohs. The conquerors even contributed to the proud culture that existed for millennia along the banks of the Nile. They introduced an upright loom that improved Egyptian weaving techniques, and they bequeathed the Egyptians such musical instruments as the long-necked lute, the lyre, the oboe, and the tambourine. Of far more interest to the Theban princes, however, were the weapons and other accoutrements of war that the Hyksos had wielded in their conquest. Chain armor, battle axes, long-range and high-velocity composite bows made of wood, animal tendons and horn, and, above all, the light, horse-drawn chariots that were the scourge of the era's battlefields. By the time that Chamos of Thebes moved against the Hyksos and their king, Apophis of Avaris, the Egyptians themselves had copied the deadly armory that once wrought their downfall. "I sailed downstream in might to repel the Asiatics," Chamos later exulted. "My valiant army before me like a fiery flame." A Hyksos vassal, commanding a force, confronted the prince at the town of Nefrusi, 160 miles north of Thebes. "Break of day," Chamos continued, "I was upon him like a hawk. By breakfast time I had driven him back, destroyed them all, and slain his people. My soldiers were like lions at their prey, carrying off their slaves, cattle, oils, and honey, and partitioning their property with joyful hearts." And on that triumphant note, Chamos' account of the campaign ended. He died, perhaps in battle, sometime before the fall of the heavily fortified Hyksos capital at Avaris. His young successor, Ahmose, concluded the long reign and eventually sent the Hyksos scurrying back into Palestine and Syria, their reign in Egypt over. Ahmose pursued, and the progress of his army, as it plodded across the burning sands of the Sinai, constituted for Egypt the dawn of a new and magnificent age. Bursting out of the geographic cocoon that always confined it, Egypt, in little more than a century, would build an empire that stretched some 2,000 miles in length. Through their control of crucial trade routes and from the tribute exacted in the lands they conquered, the Egyptians would achieve an opulence previously unknown to human civilization. Egypt would prosper under a woman who usurped the pharaonic crown and would survive the ruinous effects of a religious and cultural upheaval led by strange seemingly misshapen ruler. Under a succession of soldier kings who resurrected its imperial glory, Egypt would stand resplendent upon a summit of wealth and power, until at last decay set in, and a long, slow decline began. Ahmos's incursion was but the first tentative step along the road to empire. For 3 years the Egyptian king laid siege to Saruhan, a town in southern Palestine where the Hyksos leaders had taken refuge, and when it finally fell he withdrew from Asia. Ahmos died in 1546 BCE and was succeeded by Amenhotep I and then by Thutmose I. Although each in his turn renewed the campaigns in Asia, their expeditions were hesitant at best. The two successors were content to wrest whatever tribute they could from the small city-states along the route of the march, and to hold at bay the rising pretensions of the Mitanni, who had installed themselves in the watershed of the Euphrates River. After taking his place on the throne, Thutmose I proceeded to march through Syria to the upper Euphrates, where the Egyptians marveled at the peculiar behavior of a river that, unlike their own Nile, flowed from north to south instead of from south to north. To Thutmose and his army, the phenomenon was inverted water which flows downstream when really flowing upstream. When confronted by forces leagued with Mitanni, Thutmose defeated them soundly, and countless were the captives whom the king carried off in his victory. But despite the pharaoh's scribes proclaiming that the whole of the earth was under his 2 feet, the foray was in truth little more than a hit-and-run raid. Thutmose made no attempt to establish a permanent military or colonial presence in Asia, and hardly had his soldiers left the region than the Syrian princes stopped paying the tribute they had pledged. Nubia, to Egypt's south, was a more pressing matter. Known to the Egyptians as the land of Cush, it yielded enormous amounts of gold from its mines. Moreover, Nubia linked Egypt with the Sudanese regions, was the source of the treasured African exotics such as ivory, ebony, leopard skin, ostrich eggs and plumes, and along with more practical commodities included cattle and slaves. The pharaohs had controlled Nubia until the Hyksos invaded Egypt. The Nubians had then seized the opportunity to break away from the Egyptian dominance. Under Thutmose I, Egypt managed to subdue all Nubian resistance and regain homogeny, making Nubia its southernmost province. The land was placed in the charge of a viceroy, embellished with the title of Prince of Cush and Overseer of the Southern Lands. Answerable only to the pharaoh, this governor was responsible for ensuring that Thebes received a steady traffic of ships laden with ivory, ebony, and every other beautiful product of the land, in addition to the yield of the harvest. Within his own realm, the viceroy commanded the armed forces. In addition, he indoctrinated the tribespeople so thoroughly with Egyptian ideas and institutions that in the distant future, Nubia would remain faithful to the Egyptian model long after Egypt itself had fallen to foreigners. At home, Amenhotep I sought a return to the traditions that had prevailed before the takeover by the Hyksos, particularly pyramid building to house the royal remains. His successor, Thutmose I, however, started a new tradition. Instead of constructing a pyramid as his final resting place, he decreed that his mummified remains should be hidden in a tomb hewn out in the limestone cliffs of an isolated valley that lay beyond the mountains of western Thebes. Clearly undertaken to thwart thieves, who were already pillaging the graves of the wealthy, the tomb-building project was, according to a nobleman who supervised the excavation work, carried out in such great secrecy, with no one seeing and no one hearing. Subsequent pharaohs followed the precedent set by Thutmose I until the brooding, 1,000-foot-high cliffs of the so-called Valley of the King were honeycombed by passageways leading to the sepulchres of no fewer than 40 monarchs. For Egypt, the shift in royal burial policy had unforeseen consequences. Previously, pharaonic mortuary chapels, where the last rites were held, had been situated close to the pyramidal tombs, making it easy for the pharaoh's spirit to journey back and forth to them. Now, however, the cramped valley offered no space for the chapels, which were built instead beyond the western mountain barrier. Perhaps to compensate for the inconvenience thereby caused to the king's traveling spirits, and certainly to show off the mortuary chapels as tangible evidence of royal affluence, the pharaohs lavished Egypt's wealth on the chapels, which gradually grew in size and grandeur. Thus, in the 5th generation after Thutmose I, the chapel complex of Amenhotep III, with its golden doors and silver pavements, was designed as an everlasting fortress, possessor of eternity. The mortuary establishments of the pharaohs, as well as the temples dedicated to the gods they revered, required enormous staffs to conduct religious ceremonies and to maintain the premises. Amenhotep would claim that he had assigned the staggering total of 89,600 Asiatic slaves to work on temple properties, while Amenhotep III would boast that his own mortuary estate was filled with male and female slaves, the children of the chiefs of all the foreign lands. With Thutmose I ensconced in his lonely tomb, there occurred an extraordinary interruption in this succession of military-minded kings who had set Egypt on the course of empire. The dead king's son and successor, Thutmose II, was scarcely 20 years old, physically feeble, mentally flaccid, and badly henpecked by his wife, Hatshepsut, who also happened to be his half-sister. Such incestuous arrangements were by no means uncommon in dynastic Egypt. As might be expected, these unions led to some wildly tangled relationships. When Hatshepsut, as the great royal wife, failed to produce a male heir to the throne, a son of Thutmose II by a harem girl was designated to succeed. At the same time, the boy, a mere child, was declared married to one of Hatshepsut's daughters by Thutmose II, and thus, when Thutmose II died and Thutmose III inherited the crown at the age of 6, the regent named to control affairs during the next king's childhood was none other than Hatshepsut, who was at once his aunt, his stepmother, as well as mother-in-law. As a princess, Hatshepsut, by her own description, had been exceedingly good to look upon, a beautiful maiden, fresh and serene of nature. She was also extremely ambitious, even unscrupulous, and after biding her time as controlling regent for perhaps a couple of years, she declared herself to be Egypt's pharaoh, ignoring Thutmose III's right to succession. Her qualifications in this were dubious. As a woman, she technically could not rule as pharaoh. To endow her assumption with the divine approval, she had reliefs made showing the god Amun-Re wooing her mother on the occasion of Hatshepsut's conception. To gloss over her gender, Hatshepsut was depicted as flat-chested, in a king's clothing, wearing a false beard that customarily adorned the faces of male pharaohs. Indeed, she took for herself all the usual pharaonic titles, save one, that of the mighty bull. Her sovereignty caused endless confusion among Egyptian scribes who alternately called their royal master she and he. Despite her treachery, Hatshepsut proved to be an able ruler. Egypt was in submission, wrote a scribe, for she was a dictator of excellent plans. Generally eschewing the military adventures of her predecessors, she focused on restoring Egypt to its former prosperity by renewing the foreign commerce that had lapsed during the Hyksos occupation. In the 9th year of her reign, for example, she dispatched a trading expedition to the fabulous land of Punt on Africa's Somalian coast. Sailing the length of the Red Sea, 5 great cargo ships made safe landfall at Punt, where the seamen were personally greeted by a local prince and his wife. Egyptians treated the chief and his spouse to a banquet of beer, bread, wine, meat, fruits, and all the good things of Egypt. When the feasting was done, the trading began. In exchange for such trinkets as rings and beads, the visitors loaded the holds of their ship with all kinds of beautiful plants, heaps of myrrh, live myrrh trees, ebony, genuine ivory, gold, costly woods, incense, eye cosmetics, apes, monkeys, greyhounds, leopard skins, and slaves together with their children. The return of the fleet on the occasion for the pharaoh Hatshepsut to briefly cast aside her masculine pretensions and make her limbs fragrant as the dew of the gods with ointments and myrrh. Throughout Hatshepsut's reign, the helpless Thutmose III seethed and plotted. He was clearly a stronger man than his hapless father, yet not until he was in his late 20s did he muster enough power to oust the usurper, who apparently died in the process. The manner of Hatshepsut's overthrow is unknown. So was the cause of her death, which under the circumstances may very well have been violent. At any rate, no sooner had he grasped the crown that was properly his than Thutmose III, in a burst of released frustration, set out to erase his stepmother's name from Egyptian memory. Following his orders, squads of men spread the length and breadth of the land, hacking Hatshepsut's name from her monuments and the walls of her temples. Thutmose also let it be known that he meant to reverse the hated Hatshepsut's peaceable policies. On the day he assumed power, the new ruler proclaimed general mobilization of Egypt's armed forces. He was well prepared for the role of conqueror. During the long and restless years he spent waiting to become pharaoh, Thutmose, in the established tradition of a sporting king, had schooled himself in martial arts and avocations. Although small of stature, he was extremely strong, and his scribes were tireless in describing his physical feats. He used to shoot at a copper target, wrote one. It was an ingot of beaten copper, 3 fingers thick, with his arrow stuck in it, having passed through and protruding out the other side by 3 handbreadths. I speak accurately of what he did. After all, it was in the presence of the entire army. In the spring of 1483 BCE, Thutmose set forth with his army towards Syria, where the bonds forged by the early pharaohs of the 18th dynasty had been cast off while Hatshepsut reigned. With the lapse of Egyptian influence, Mitanni had moved into northern Syria and had set up a group of vassal states in northern and central Palestine as a buffer against future Egyptian incursions. And so it was that Thutmose III found himself confronted by a coalition of 330 Canaanite princes, loyal to the Mitanni and commanded by the king of Kadesh. After leaving Gaza on the Mediterranean coast, the Egyptian army took a caravan route that led inland to the foot of Carmel Ridge. There, Thutmose ascertained through spies that the enemy had taken a defensive position in the neighborhood of Megiddo, a fortified town that lay beyond the ridge of the plain of Esdraelon. Of the 3 routes the Egyptians might take to attack their assembled foes, the shortest and most direct was through the mountain defile of Aruna. But, as the army's cautious commanders pointed out at a war council, it was by far the most dangerous. The pass was so narrow that the army would have to march horse after horse and man after man, thereby offering the enemy superb opportunity for ambush. Alternatively, the Canaanites could choose to wait until the Egyptian divisions began to emerge from the pass, then attack and defeat them piecemeal. Thutmose himself made the decision. "I will march on this road to Aruna," he declared. As related by Egyptian chronicles, the choice was based mostly on considerations of prestige. "They will say, these enemies whom Re abominates, has His Majesty set out on another road because he has become afraid of us? So they will speak." Yet, given the military acuity Thutmose III would demonstrate throughout his career, it seems likely that the pharaoh also calculated that the perilous Aruna Pass would be the last route the Canaanites would expect him to take. Whatever motivated the pharaoh's decision, it proved a good one in the end. The Canaanites failed to seize advantage, and the Egyptians made their way through the pass without incident, camping on the edge of the plain of Esdraelon. On the eve of the battle, the proclamation sounded in the Egyptian camp. "Prepare ye, make your weapons ready, since the pharaoh will engage in combat with that wretched enemy in the morning." At dawn, the Egyptians debouched the plain, led by Thutmose III. The pharaoh subsequently related that he rode in a golden chariot, arrayed in his panoply of war, like Horus, mighty of arm. As one Egyptian told it, the Canaanites were waiting to meet them. Millions of men and hundreds of thousands, the chiefest of all lands, standing in their chariots. This was an exaggeration. The enemy army, which barred the direct approach to Megiddo, probably was relatively weak, and larger forces guarded routes to the north and south, just as Tutmosis may have foreseen. At any rate, the famed Battle of Megiddo was in fact a rout. Only 83 Canaanites were killed, 340 taken prisoner. The rest fled to the fortifications of Megiddo to find the gates already shut against the Egyptians. Many Canaanite warriors, including the king of Kadesh, were forced to knot their own clothing into ropes and haul themselves over the town walls. Still, the Egyptian troops failed to press their assault, and as a result, Tutmosis was required to undertake a siege. 7 months passed before the Canaanite leaders, starved at last to submission, emerged from the town and fell at the pharaoh's feet, as Tutmosis himself put it, to beg breath for their nostrils. Tutmosis showed mercy in that instance. He reported that he allowed his enemies to leave, and they went, all of them, on donkeys, the king said, for I'd taken their horses, and I carried off all of their citizens to Egypt, and their property likewise. The Egyptian booty included 924 chariots, 2,232 horses, 3,929 cattle, 20,500 other animals, along with 87 children of the Canaanite rulers, and 1,796 persons of lesser rank. Far more important, the fall of Megiddo was to Tutmosis as significant as the capture of 1,000 cities. It brought nearly all of northern Palestine and southern Syria under Egyptian control. The pharaoh's martial ambitions were by no means satisfied, however. He envisioned the Egyptian empire that would extend throughout Syria to the banks of the middle Euphrates and the ranges of the Taurus Mountains. To achieve that aim, Tutmosis III was constantly on the march. Spring after spring, in the course of at least 14 campaigns, he led his legions into battle. Capturing the ports of Phoenicia, he thereby transported his troops by water and used the newly won cities as bases of supply and communication for his inland excursions. Finally, making his major move against the Mitanni, he constructed a fleet of boats from the cedars of the Lebanese mountains near Byblos and carted the vessels on ox-drawn wagons across the bleak and hostile terrain. Arriving at the Euphrates, the army was ferried across the great stream and fell upon the Mitannian homeland. As Tutmosis wrote, "My majesty devastated it, and it was turned to red dust on which no foliage will ever grow again." Having made his point, Tutmosis withdrew, recrossing the river and erecting a monument to himself beside the one commemorating the brief incursion of his grandfather, Tutmosis I. This time, however, the Egyptians were here to stay, and even the expansion-minded Mitanni came to recognize the Euphrates as the boundary beyond which they dared not pass. Indeed, so willing were the old enemies to accept the status quo that they eventually entered into a treaty of alliance and, to cement the relationship later, an Egyptian pharaoh took a pair of Mitanni princesses as brides. In their administration of Syrian and Palestinian territories, Tutmosis III and most of his successors showed a lenient touch that they failed to display elsewhere. In Nubia, for example, where Egyptian holdings by now extended as far as the Nile's fourth cataract, the Egyptian overlords forbade local chiefs to exercise power, but the petty rulers of Palestine and Syria were generally permitted to keep their seats and enjoy a certain independence, as long as they behaved themselves as good vassals and kept paying tribute into Egyptian coffers. Above all, they had to guarantee to the Egyptians unimpeded use of the historic trade routes that opened the way north to Asia Minor, east to Babylon and Assyria, west to Crete, Cyprus, and the islands of the Aegean, and even to the Greek mainland. In a sort of insurance policy against revolt, the sons of the vassaled monarchs were often taken as hostages to Egypt, where they were treated royally, housed in splendid palace, and schooled as Egyptians. That practice also paid long-term premium. On the death of their fathers, the thoroughly Egyptianized princes were often installed upon their native thrones, where they ruled in fond and faithful recollection of the time when they had been taken to Egypt as children to serve the king as their lord and to stand at the door of the king. uprisings were inevitable. Such transgressions were of course rudely punished, as one pharaoh warned a vassal king, "If for any reason you harbor any thought of enmity or hatred in your heart, then you and all your family are condemned to death." On the other hand, the rewards of loyalty, which included the pledge of protection against all foreign and domestic enemies, could be considerable. Wrote a pharaoh, "If you show yourself submissive, what is there that the king cannot do for you?" To keep the subjugated domains under control, the Egyptian military presence was deemed necessary. Garrisons of archers and charioteers, charged with keeping the peace, were stationed throughout Syria and Palestine. They were supplied by the vassal states, which were required to provide Egyptian soldiers with food, drink, cattle, sheep, honey, and oil. The Egyptian army reached the peak of professionalism under Thutmose III. It was organized in 4 divisions, each numbering about 5,000 men and marching under the standard of a god, after whom it was named, as in the division of Amun, or the division of the beauty of Re. Like all armies, it was heavily endowed with staff officers, among them a master of the horse, who supervised the mounts and chariots that carried Egypt's warriors into battle, and keeper of army registers, who was in charge of conscription, and keeper of hostages, who was responsible for tending and controlling prisoners of war. In addition, the pharaoh also supported by his own retinue, which included the king's charioteer, and the king's bow carrier, the king's armor-bearer, and even the king's barber. It would appear, however, that such positions were no rear echelon sinecures. The 18th dynasty pharaohs often led their troops into battle, and where they went, so did their personal retainers. Thus, the reward for valor, one barber was given, as a slave, a prisoner whom he had personally captured, while the king's butler received 7 head of cattle. As always, the life of the lowly infantryman was hard. "Let me tell you of the woes of the soldier," went one lament of the sort that has been heard ever since humans first bore arms. "He may not rest, his march is uphill through mountains, he drinks water every 3rd day, his body ravaged by illness. The enemy comes and surrounds him with missiles, and he is told, 'Quick, forward, valiant soldier!'" Yet such a life was hardly more arduous than the one spent by the peasant, laboring in the fields or on the pharaoh's construction gangs, and there were compensations in the form of food, clothing, shelter, and medical aid. Moreover, although the rank-and-file soldier probably did not receive regular wages for his service, he was often allowed to share in the spoils of war. Even a greater incentive was the chance for a man to rise above his station in the army's lowest rank, to a proud position as standard-bearer, and perhaps to end his career as battalion commander. For those born of means, an army career offered opportunity almost without limit. Many high-ranking officers had been companions of the pharaoh since childhood, when they had been selected on the basis of their aristocratic status and potential merit to attend the royal nursery and to matriculate in the king's court. They formed an unofficial yet highly exclusive club whose members combined the characteristics of courtier and soldier. As army officers, both they and the pharaohs, who proved their worth in the battlefield, could expect to receive, from a grateful pharaoh, many splendid gifts in the form of ceremonial weapons, valuable gold necklaces, known as the Gold of Valor, and grants of tax-free land on which they could build their estates. Army officers might also take on duties that had little if anything to do with their military service. One talented general, for example, was given appointment as overseer of the buildings of Amun, overseer of fields, and overseer of the priests of Upper and Lower Egypt. In that manner, the military gradually insinuated itself in the civil branch of a nation that had, since its earliest times, depended on the pervasive bureaucracy. The day would come when no position in the Egyptian realm would appear to be beyond the reach of an ambitious general, not even the awesome office of pharaoh. This army, unparalleled in the ancient world, and the mighty empire it would help create, was Thutmose's legacy. When he died in 1425, after a reign of nearly 55 years, his mummified remains were placed in a shaft reaching deep into the cliffside, the Valley of the Kings, not far from the spot where his old stepmother and enemy, Hatshepsut, was entombed. Such was the power of his armed legions that during the 40 years between his death and the accession of his great-grandson Amenhotep III, no major foe arose to challenge Egyptian supremacy. That must have been satisfactory to Amenhotep III, who took easily to the ways of the voluptuary, while his nation, flourishing in the wealth of the entire Middle East, followed him into a golden age largely devoted to this pursuit of pleasure.